Well, hey, everyone. So glad to be here with all of you today. Looking forward to a great conversation on all about money, all about marriage, all about both. We're really excited to jump in and get to participate in this with you. This is Jade Webinar. I don't know what I came up with webinar. That's not your last name. Your last name. I was looking at the webinar thing on my screen. This is Jade Warshaw. Starts with the W.
I'll take it.
Jade Warshaw, Ramsey personality. Jade, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to be here.
A webinar is my middle name. I got here because my husband and I had to walk through the journey of paying off over $460,000 of debt. And when Tim and I were talking about what are some things that we can do for a webinar, I thought, this is perfect because half of what we did was getting on the same page to actually be able to pay off that money. So it took us 7.5 years and we were able to pay off every single bit of it. And so, you know, my goal is just to let people know that it's possible and hopefully give them some hope, Tim, and hopefully inspire people on their journey. But, you know, today we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty about how to really dig into this, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And this, y'all, this is going to be a fun one. This is interactive. You get to interact with Jade, you get to interact with me. I'm one of the senior coaches here on the team. Came into coaching from the world of marriage counseling and also been married for 15 years. So I've got a little bit of experience in handling money and marriage over the years.
Too.
That's awesome. Yeah. Congratulations.
Yes.
So there we go. 30 years combined here.
Love it.
So we're going to have some great conversations from some different perspectives. And you know, this is conversation. We want you to be able to jump in and participate. So as you have questions, there's a couple ways to get your questions answered today. Inside the chat box in the Q&A, we've got a couple of our team members here. We've got Justin and Tyler joining us from our coaching team here. And so if you have questions specifically for Jade and I, make sure you're dropping those in the Q&A box. And they're actually going to send some of those questions over to us. And, you know, if you're able to chat with us live, let them know that you would like to chat with us live. We do, in fact, have the opportunity and ability to unmute you and bring you on, and we can talk through these things live today.
That'd be great.
Now, you may also be in a situation where you're not ready for that, or you're thinking, I don't know if I can ask this question. Like, I don't want my name thrown out there. It's okay. Ask your question, say, change my name, and no, I can't talk live. We'll answer anonymous questions. We're here to help you. We want to serve you the best way that we can. And part of the thing that we want you to be aware of, we are recording this, and we are going to send this out to everyone who registered today. So if you want to hear these things again, or maybe, just calling this out, you're listening to this and you're waiting for your spouse to hear what we've got to say, and you want to go back and play this for them later, you're going to have the opportunity to do that as well. But because of that, we want to make sure you know that you're on recording today. So if you don't want to have your voice or your name recorded, make sure you let Tyler and Justin know that so we can make sure we get you taken care of there as we walk through some questions.
So Tim, basically you want them to use this podcast to win the argument.
I'm not saying to do that. I'm also not saying not to do that. Figure out how many knots that is. Because, you know, sometimes, and here's the thing, our job is not to be the referees for your marriages. But if we can help, we want to.
Absolutely.
We both have the passion for marriage. We want to help you get connected. We come at this from some very different ideas and ways of being. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this is about you and your marriage and the situation, the relationships that you find yourselves in. And we want those things to be better for you, for your families, for your futures. And for those of you that have kids, one of the best things you can give as a gift to your children is to love their mother or father well.
Oh man, that is the key to, I feel like that's the key to world peace right there. That's a good word too.
All right, let's shut it down 5 minutes in. Why not, right? We've solved it all. We're done.
So good. I love that. That's true.
Now, that being said, we have not, in fact, solved it all. We actually have some really great things we want to talk through today. We've got some stuff that we want to share with you, some things that we've prepared. And we know some of you are probably sitting there with notebooks like, would you get to it already? Yes, let's do that.
Let's do it.
So I would love to find out. You have this really important idea. You talked about communication being the key. Tell me more about that, Jade.
Yes. You know, I'll tell you early on when my husband, his name is Sam, when we first met, this was before we were married. You know, we started talking about finances and our financial expectations. and how we viewed money early on. And it's kind of lucky that we did. It wasn't because we were just so smart and we knew all the things. You guys are smarter than we were because you're actually tuning into a webinar and you're learning these things. Sam and I did not do that. It just kind of happened by default. And it's such a good thing that it happened because, you know, the mountain that we later needed to climb required that conversation. And, you know, when I look back on it, I realized that we had a lot of very difficult conversations early. And what I mean by that is when you start talking finances with somebody that you're engaged to, or even your spouse of 5-10 years, it's not always easy because we're laying bare our soul, right? It's not easy to divulge that you have debt. It's not easy to say, you know, these are the mistakes that I've made with money, but those are the conversations that we want to have early and often. And I always say this, I always say, you be the one to go first. You know, if you can approach your spouse, if you're dating and you want to approach that person, or if you're engaged, if you're dating, I always say, try to do it early, because if you wait and now it's like, oh, I love this person, you know, he's so sweet, this might be the one. And then you find out that his ideals or her ideals on money, if you don't agree with whatever gender roles that they believe in, if you don't agree with how they view debt, maybe they think that debt is leverage. And you believe that debt is dumb, you know, that those are hard to overcome, but you can overcome them. And so I always say, have those hard conversations early and often, be the one to go first, be open and honest. And I think that that helps pull down a lot of the walls that you face, Tim.
Now, when you say early, we're talking like first date, right? So it's like you sit down, appetizers maybe, before the entrees come, you're like, by the way, we just need to have the money talk, right?
I don't think that early.
Okay, not
Tim.
that early. So how early is too early?
I think you kind of have to judge by the person and the feeling, because I do think that on that first date, you do get some cues.
Yeah.
Number one, you get that cue is, are we even going to go on a second date?
Yeah.
But I think that like 2 or 3 dates into it, you might mention, and I would just mention it by this, oh, like there's this guy I listened to on the radio, Dave Ramsey. Have you ever heard of that? Like, I don't think you just pound into it and go, what are your views on debt? How much debt do you have? I don't think that you do that. I think that you find easy on-ramps like, oh man, I heard this, I saw this thing on Instagram. It was so cool. It was talking about, and if you use those just easy on-ramp things, you can start to learn what the other person's view is on money without asking those, you know, direct, hard-hitting questions. Because if it just feels like a normal conversation, they're going to divulge that without even, you know, realizing that you're putting a test on them. So,
well, and sometimes you can even display this. So for example, if you're the one paying and you actually pull out like a cash envelope or even just foldable paper money that so few people use. Yeah. And it's like, that's interesting. Cash, really? Yeah. I'm not a huge fan of credit cards. Really? Tell me more. You can have those conversations, like she said, early and often, and start sharing what it is you value. The whole purpose of dating is to figure out, is this somebody I actually want to spend more time with, possibly the rest of my life? Yes. And the whole purpose of marriage is, can we do life better together than we could have separately? And you're not going to set yourself up for success in marriage if you're not operating from some of these same basic principles and fundamentals. Now, you've mentioned a couple other things really interesting. You talked about being open and honest, and we talked about going first. How do we make sure we go first without putting the other person on blast, right? It's not, I'm going first so that I can tell you everything that I think is wrong with you.
Yes.
Because that doesn't work so well.
Well, in marriage, Tim, as you know, 15 years, I've got 15 years, you rarely want to talk at the other person or highlight the things they're doing. You want to highlight what you're doing, whether it's your flaws, the things you're working on, the things where you're seeing success, as much as you can focus on you. And I think that's kind of goes without saying anything, as much as you can focus on your areas of change or growth, as opposed to saying, you need to do this, and it would be better if you could do that. If you can keep it to yourself and say, well, you know, something I'm working on lately is budgeting. You know, in the past, I haven't been great with this, and now I'm working on budgeting. Or, you know, something that I've recently come to believe is that like debt is really hurting me. So I've been working to pay off my debt. Saying things like that, as opposed to asking them, so are you paying off debt? Do you have debt? Have you, you know, what are your views on, you know, that can be very, very off-putting. And so I like to approach conversations more along the lines of, hey, this is what I'm working on. Hey, this is what I read, you know, and approach it that way. It's a much more approachable. And something else I found, Tim, over the years with Sam is, you know, these conversations, they're ongoing. You know, it's not just like we talked about it once, got it out of the way, it's over. these conversations continue. And one trick that Sam and I have used is usually when it's time to talk about not just money, but any difficult conversation, we go on a walk. And I think that there's a little bit of psychology behind this.
Now, real quick, for clarity, you go on a walk together, or one of you goes on a walk to cool off and then you come back?
I gotta go cool off. Well, here's the thing. If we start on a walk together, we stay on the walk together.
It's usually for the best.
Yeah. If we start in the kitchen, eye to eye like this, and somebody's going, you know what you need to do, then it ends up a walk alone to cool off. So let's avoid that.
Yeah.
I suggest saying, hey, let's take a walk. And when you walk, you're both looking forward and maybe you're holding hands, and it's kind of easy to speak about the things that are hard because you're not just sitting there, knee to knee, just boring each other in the eye. And there's something about that. I don't think that you pick up on as much of the social cues that you might pick up on when you're sitting like across the table because you're walking. So if somebody kind of like slightly rolls their eyes, or if somebody like has a facial expression that might otherwise trigger you, you might not notice it, which is actually a really good thing. So taking a walk is really great. I also think not standing in one place and just looking at each other talking, I feel like that is something, again, it's just very off-putting because it's kind of like that argumentative stance. Like we're both standing here, we're both arguing. If you are going to be in one place, sit down, right? And again, sit next to each other, try to hold hands, something like that. That's just going to take that tension away. The worst thing you want to do is be standing in your kitchen, looking at folks, having conversations about money. That's my personal take on it.
And one of the things I'll add that's really important to understand is every couple has these things, and the psychological technical term for these things is called a repair attempt. And this is what happens during a conversation, especially a heated one, when one of you does something to try to bring the air down. Maybe it's a silly face, a particular inside joke, sticking your tongue out at the other person, something along the lines where it normally causes tension to leave. And a lot of times in a healthy relationship, even in a tense moment, you'll see these things and they work out really well. One of the things to be aware of is if one of you or both of you are doing these things and they're not working well, they're no longer taking, and it actually serves to bring the tension up. This is the time to get a good marriage counselor involved. This is one of the prime indicators that things are about to go very, very poorly. When the repair attempts fail, we're in a really bad spot.
So you mean when if somebody tries to make light of the situation, like bring some levity in, like if somebody kind of makes a little joke, lighthearted, right? If that's not
we're trying to make the whole thing not seriously, but if we're clearly just trying to bring the tension down a couple notches, and so one of us will tell a funny joke or not insulting joke. We're not talking about that kind of humor in this moment, but says something silly. You're trying to bring the tension down and it's not working. That's a really, really big danger sign. That's a huge red flag inside of a marriage that things have gotten really bad with the communication.
I would agree with that. That's a really good point, Tim. And, with communication, there's always that you have to read the room. You've got to read your audience and you've got to see, okay, like, we're talking about having these hard conversations. Pick a good time. After work, when things are stressed, probably not a good time. Like both of you are tired, try to pick a time where both of you are, it's like, okay, like this is a date night, or this is, we're both feeling good. It's the weekend. All of those things matter. Like I said, and the other thing, whether you're married, possibly engaged, you might be able to use this one, but try to just do a rehab on your vocabulary. I call it a vocab rehab. Don't say the words I, me, you, yours, especially when you're talking about debt and money. If you are married, like Dave says all the time, you become French, you become oui, right? So as much as you can say things like, the debt that we're facing, or here are some things that I noticed in our finances, or here are some things that I noticed in our spending habits, right? As opposed to saying, I see that you went to Chick-fil-A again, and your debt is the reason that we don't get to go on vacation, or your debt's the reason that I don't get to go on vacation.
Yikes.
Kim, this is escalation right here.
That's how you skip over the counselor's office and then straight to the divorce attorney's office right there.
But you can diffuse so much by changing that vocabulary and saying the words we, let's talk about our finances. Let's talk about our money. Those words, we, our, us, they bring you together.
It's a team.
It's a team. And that's what matters in that communication.
Now, when the communication breaks down, there's usually a couple things to really be on the lookout for. And these are signs, especially of really, really heavy cracks that will actually potentially end a relationship. And so I didn't make these up. I stole these from John Gottman, author of the 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. Love that book. But one of the things that we've discovered is there are certain key indicators that you can watch for in your relationships, in your marriages especially, that let you know this is bad. In fact, he calls these the 4 horsemen of the marriage apocalypse.
Ooh, the apocalypse.
We're full on end of the world here, right? And the first of these is that criticism. And Jade, you've kind of been describing this already. It's when we start, it's the you statements. You're ruining our budget. You're messing everything up. You're the reason that we can't have the things that we want. You're the reason that we can't do these things for our kids. Fill in the blank here, but it's this criticism back and forth, and not a healthy, let's get better. We're not talking about healthy critique here. We're talking about a full-on criticism of each other that is no longer healthy. And a lot of times what happens is we move from criticism into the second horseman, which is contempt.
Wow.
When you begin to hold this criticism for each other, you begin to really distrust each other. And you think about your significant other, you think about your partner, your spouse, your husband, your wife, and you're saying, this person is not a great person. And I remember,
so it's ill will.
It's ill will, and it's ill thoughts. And I remember one of the things that I heard when my wife and I were doing our premarital counseling back in the day, probably the most formative thing I've ever heard in marriage. One of our premarital counselors said, you have to avoid evil suspicions.
That's so good.
And evil suspicions are when we automatically assume that the thing our spouse or partner is doing to us, they're doing to hurt us. Seeing everything from somebody, anyone ever said something silly and want to take it back? Yep. When we say that and our partner, our spouse immediately goes to, I think they're trying to hurt me. Why would you say that to me that way? I didn't mean to say it to you that way. It just came out. But it's this contempt. It's one of you gets stuck at the office for an extra 30 minutes and you're 30 minutes late coming home, and the person who's already at home thinks they're cheating.
Oh yeah. So it's just going to the worst possible scenario.
And it's this negative feeling. It's this contempt, this thing in our gut that we feel terrible when we think about the person we're supposed to love the most.
Oh yeah. There's a book. It's not the 5 love languages. It's the other big marriage book that everybody reads. Man, I can't remember what it's called, but he talks about approaching every conversation with goodwill. And so it's kind of that same idea of you have goodwill, you're thinking the best about them. And it's funny what you said about, well, not funny, it's kind of sad what you said about the criticism, because it's true. When you approach that, a topic that's so delicate, like personal finance, because the Bible says where your money is, your heart is. So the decisions that you've made around money, you take it personally, whether you want to admit it or not. And so when you approach that with criticism, it does so much damage. I remember having a couple of conversations with my husband early on, because, if you know a little bit about our debt story, we had $280,000 of student loan debt. Only 34 of it was, quote, my debt. And when he let me know the amount, now you might call this ignorance, you might call it wisdom.
Ignorance is not always bliss, by the way.
It's not. But in the moment he told me, and it was kind of like, okay, like it didn't really faze me. And again, I'm not saying that to credit myself. It might have been a lot of just ignorance on my part, but it didn't scare me away. And he says to this day, he goes, Jade, when I told you that, the fact that you just blinked and smiled, it meant everything to me. The fact that you didn't go, oh my goodness, how could you do this? What,
you moron.
So there could have been so many reactions. And because of that reaction, it paved the way for us to have more conversations. And so I think that criticism is such it creates a safe space. If you can approach a topic, not criticize, just be understanding, understand this is a human being, mistakes happen. And, they didn't do it to hurt me. This was their own personal thing. That goodwill, you really get yourself off on the right track by doing that.
And it helps remove that contempt from becoming an option. So we have criticism, we have contempt. The third of these horsemen, defensiveness. When every time we step into a discussion, we feel like we're constantly having to put our walls up, right? There was that song a few years ago, Why Does Love Always Feel Like a Battlefield? When love feels like a battlefield, we're in defensiveness.
That's true.
When we always have the walls up, when we always think, before I can present something to my spouse, before I can tell her, before I can tell him, this is what I'm feeling, I have to make sure I have a plan ready on how I'm going to protect myself. This is a huge problem. And when we're experiencing defensiveness, and this can go both directions, this could be one of you, this could be both of you, but when defensiveness is here, we know that trust is broken because we are no longer a safe space for one another. And marriage should be a safe space for one another, which gets us into the fourth and final of the horsemen, stonewalling.
Ooh.
When we just shut it down. And if you all want to see a really interesting moment of this, one of the TV doesn't always get like mental health and marriage and conflict, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes it does. And one of the most poignant moments I've ever seen of this was on the TV show The Office. And I'm going to assume most of us have seen it because The Office is amazing. But in the final season, spoilers, but it's been off the air for 10 years. If you haven't seen it, that's on you.
Yeah.
But in the final season, this couple who we watched, the will they, won't they get married, they're having these things and their marriage is on the rocks. They're having some trouble and they reach a spot where they no longer want to fight. And one of them has a conversation with some friends of theirs that's going through a divorce. And they said that the moment they knew it was over was when they stopped fighting. And so this couple on Valentine's Day decides that they're going to spend their Valentine's Day by fighting. And as they're leaving the office, the husband actually says to the wife, put up your dukes, let's go. That was a healthy moment in there. When we stop fighting, it means we no longer care enough to fix it.
Wow.
And so when you reach a spot of defensiveness, when you reach a spot where I don't want to fight you anymore, I'm just trying to protect myself. And we've gone on from defensiveness into stonewalling to we're just going to shut this down. If you don't get immediate help from a qualified professional, this is how the marriage ends.
Wow.
And so it's so important to watch these things and watch for signs of these. And it could be one, it could be two, it could be all four of these. They don't have to go in order, but watch for these things in your relationships.
Man, that's really good. I'm just thinking about what you were saying, and I'm thinking, do you think that sometimes the defensiveness and the stonewalling early on, is it rooted in like shame? Is it rooted in guilt? Because I'm thinking to myself, the times that I've been defensive towards Sam or towards really anybody, it's usually rooted in some form of insecurity, right? Because it's like, I don't feel good about this. And so you start, coming up with that list. And usually if you take it even a layer deep, it's because, man, I'm insecure about this because I feel shame about this or because I feel guilt about this. And especially with money, I mean, there's so much guilt and shame surrounding the choices that we've made, whether, especially if we have debt or especially if, we're bringing something to the table that's less than, it's not what we wanted to bring to the table. It's not stability.
And let's call this out for a second. Not all of us are going to fall in love with the first person that we find as a useful life mate and then marry them and it's happy ever after.
Right.
And so especially if you've been through bad relationships before, or if you're on this call because you've just gotten out of a bad relationship and you're trying to figure out, if I ever get into a relationship again, how do I do it differently? These are especially when you see defensiveness and stonewalling early on. A lot of times it's because of previous experiences. It's the guilt and shame that we've taken on, but it's also sometimes the guilt and shame that we've let other people hand us. It's what Dr. John Deloney refers to as bricks in your backpack. It's these things that you get handed when you've had a previous relationship with somebody that says, you're an idiot. You're not good enough. How dare you? How could you? I hate you. All these different things. We carry these things with us. And so when we step into another relationship, those walls are up immediately.
Yeah.
And as the relationship begins, we're already showing signs of how it's going to end. And so if we can step in, and this is why it's so important to remove criticism and contempt and walk in with, this person loves me, or is on the path towards loving me. I love them, or I'm on the path towards loving them, especially if this is you and this is early on in the relationship and you're thinking about someday marrying this person. But let's start there with those positives and try to bring some of those defenses down. And if you can't bring your defenses down around the person, why? What is it about this person that's preventing this? And that can be a really interesting thing for us to really explore within ourselves, and whether or not this is somebody we should continue with. Is it because of them or is it because of me?
That's very good. Self-exploration there. So big. Yeah, because if you don't self-sabotage, you can sabotage a relationship because of something that doesn't even have to do with the current relationship,
So we talked a little bit about our communication styles.
Yes.
Talked a little bit about the things to watch for. Let's talk about what should we be doing instead, right? Let's focus on the positive for a few minutes.
Get back to the positive.
Stay in the negative all day. So what are some of the things that we should be doing, Jade?
Well, okay. Number one, and I know this is controversial because some folks, like you said, we all got a past, it's the way that we grew up, or this is what my parents did. But one of the best things that you can do if you are in a marriage relationship early on is combine your money. I like to say, mix your dough. That's one of the things that you need to do early on. And here's why. Again, it becomes we. Whenever things are separate, it's yours and it's mine.
Mhm.
And that's honestly the way that we believe. That's not the way marriage is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a combination of all things. And as I said before, where your money is, that's where your heart is. And so if your heart is in your marriage, your money should be there as well. It should be yours, mine, and ours, that whole idea. It's not my money anymore. It's our money. It's not his money. It's our money. And so once you do that, something kind of clicks where it's like, okay, I trust you. Because if you're willing to combine your money, that is the ultimate, in my mind, that's one of the ultimate signs of trust. Because if I'm a spouse and everything else is together, right? We live together, we got kids together, we eat together, we take vacations together, but suddenly when it comes to the money, I have no access. If you're on this call and you're in that position, that notes some serious inward thought, to figure out what's going on there. Is it me? Is it my spouse? Is it both of us? If it's me, why is that? Why don't I want to combine? Why don't I want to mix my dough? Right. And if it's the husband, really getting to the core of that, and remember, use those communication strategies that we talked about earlier. And
I do know coming up, we have at least one really good question on this topic that we're going to be diving into. So stick with us for a couple minutes more. We have a few more things we want to cover. We're going to dive into this. Because I know at least one of you, you're kind of walking in this scenario right now. Yes. Let's walk through this together because we want to help you out. And honestly, for everyone else listening, let's walk through one of these in a very, very significant way. So we definitely want to combine. Yes. What are some of the other things we want to make sure we're doing, Jade?
Let's see. You want to share the load. When it comes to money, it's both of you together. So let's say you're both working the baby steps. You've decided we're on the same track with money. We both agree that debt is dumb and we want to get free of our debt. And now we're working the baby steps. We're on baby step 2. We're trying to get out of debt and we're working together. When it comes to money, and not just in baby step 2, but regardless, you need to make sure you're sharing the load. You need to make sure you're doing your part. And whether it's, you're both side hustling to bring in extra money, whether it's automating your contributions. Like for instance, my husband, every month he pays all of the utilities. Anything that you can pay online, he does that part. And that's just his contribution. It's automated into our lifestyle. It's not a conversation that we have to have regularly. Yeah. So as much as you can automate these things with your spouse, okay, you're going to be the one who pays the mortgage every month. Okay, I'm going to be the one that pays all the utilities. Perfect. All right.
And for clarity, we mean the person who's writing the check.
Yes.
Out of your shared account.
Yes.
Not I pay the mortgage out of my money. You pay the utilities out of your money.
Great
this
clarification.
Is our money. Right. It's kind of like here, we have a team in our finance department, and they're the ones that make sure we all get paid because it's almost payday around here. So we love that. And they're the ones that make sure we get paid, but they're not the ones who determine those things. It's determined by the team and like Dave and the rest of the team, and they decide those things. And then there's an execution. And so in your household, Sam executes on. He's like, I'm going to be
the executioner. But
the executor, not executor. He doesn't kill the things. He just makes things happen, right? He's the get stuff done guy.
He's the get stuff done guy. And I'm the one that, that first draft of the budget, I kind of put that together and then I bring it to him and I'm like, look over this, and we do that part together. But these are the things that are now automated into our lifestyle. And honestly, it cuts down on arguments. As much as you can do that, it cuts down on arguments. As much as you can, like I said, the first step is those initial communications, but then from there on, if we can weave those into our daily life, our weekly life, and I know you've got a little something on that, on how we weave those communications into our daily and normal, set of circumstances.
Absolutely. Awesome. So we've hit a lot of these things. We talked about the fact that ignorance is not bliss.
No, it's broke.
Having these things, working together, being a team, putting it all together, automating these things. These are ways that are going to make your life easier. So another thing that you can do is what I call the DWMA.
I love this.
I'm going to break this down here real quick, but this is the DWMA plan. Highly recommend. Starts with the D, the daily download. With the kids in bed, the TV off, the phones off to the side, take 5 to 10 minutes a day to actually just talk to each other about what happened today. It's really interesting what happens when you ask the question, how was your day, and honestly mean it. And you can talk about the things that were financially significant and the things that weren't. And if nothing financially significant happened today, then talk about the other things
Yep.
that were significant in your life. But here's one of the things: when you know what's going on in each other's lives, 5 to 10 minutes a day will really help you really trust each other better. You'll know more about what's going on with each other. You'll have a more shared value system going forward just by having these conversations. And again, these are 5 or 10 minutes. You don't need to have an hour-long knockdown, drag out,
Right.
breakdown of a whole day every
Just
single
a
day.
quick check-in.
Just a quick check-in. Honestly, you can do this in bed before you fall asleep, as long as you're both still awake enough to have the conversation.
That's great.
But this is a great way to just really trust each other and love each other better. Daily download.
And can I just add in, that's a great one to habit stack with.
Yeah.
Because I like habit stacking, and I'm a follower of Craig Rochelle, and his whole thing is like, pray daily with your spouse, even if it's just, 5 minutes, just a quick prayer. And I feel like that's a good one. If that's already a habit that you have, you can stack it.
Yeah.
And it's like, we do this 5 minutes, then we do this. So if you can find something that you can stack something like that within your habits, I feel like that's an easy win.
So after the daily download, we have the weekly weigh-in. Each week, what happened this past week? What do we have coming up the current week?
I hope he's not weighing me in on the scale.
No, it's not Weight Watchers. Like that's a whole separate thing. You want to go do that, go for that. I'm not saying like stand on the scale for each other, but just weighing in. How did our last week go? What do we have coming up this week? This is the time if you need to sync your calendars for a little bit. So for example, one of the hugest budget busters for most couples is eating out. And so if on Saturday or Sunday, you take some time to think about, here's what we had this past week, this coming week, what nights do the kids have soccer practice? What night do we have an event? What nights do we have things after work? What are the nights we're going to be tempted to eat out? What are the things we need for the upcoming week, just this week? And again, this is like 30 minutes. 30 minutes tops. We're not spending hours and hours every weekend trying to break down our whole past week and have this intricate plan for the next week, unless that's both your personality styles, and then God bless you, go for it. But we want you to have the time to work together. Again, just real briefly, 10 minutes. How do we do this past week? 15 to 20 minutes. What do we have coming up this week? Let's have a plan for it.
And that's wonderful because it really plays into both of the personality styles that we see in money. Typically in money, we see the nerd and the free spirit. If you've done FPU, you've Financial Peace University, you've heard Dave and some of the other personalities talk about the nerd personality and the free spirit personality. And it's easy, if you're a nerd, it's easy to kind of hoard over all of this, right? And it's like, I'm in control of the finances, I'm in control of the calendar, I'm in control of all of this. And the free spirit sometimes needs you to kind of like shepherd them into the process. And if you do, because I'm a free spirit, well, sometimes I can be a nerd, but they appreciate that because it's like, hey, this wasn't even on my radar, but thank you for putting it on my radar. And I like what you have. It's very brief. It's not like this long drawn out because free spirits, we can't do
time
that.
Limits.
Yes.
Listen, y'all, I'm a free spirit married to a freer spirit. There is not a nerd in our relationship. I'm the de facto nerd because of what I do.
I would be the nerd.
No,
I feel like
me being the nerd is penance for the years that I drove our family off a cliff financially. I'm a nerd in other ways. But I'm not the numbers nerd.
Okay.
I collect Star Wars and all that kind of stuff, but different kind of nerdery.
You're like, I'm a memorabilia.
I'm a memorabilia collectibles nerd. It's all good. So we have the daily download. We got the weekly weigh-in. Next, we have our monthly meeting.
Love it.
And this is the time for once a month you get together. This is where the budget meeting happens. Y'all cap this at an hour. This doesn't have to take more than an hour.
I know,
and it doesn't have to be a whole hour on the budget. You could spend, especially as you get good at budgeting over the first few months, by month 4, 5, 6, your budget can take 10 to 15 minutes tops. But then it's, what do we have going on this month? What do we have that's different? Is there a major holiday this month? Is there a major birthday this month? Is there major events going on in our family? Is this a particularly busy time of the year? Or is this a time where the kids are at home? Or are we looking at the summertime where our food budget's going to look different because we're not getting them the school lunches? Wait, what is going on in our situation this month that we need to be aware of?
I love
monthly meeting. And finally, y'all, have an annual assembly.
Ooh.
Full weekend. This is the big one.
State of the Union.
But State of the Union, how are we doing on our debt payoff if we still have debt? How are we doing on our investing if we're on baby steps 4 or later? How are we doing on our overall financial goals? This is the time to review your finances. This is a time to review with each other. What is our estate plan? What happens if one of us doesn't make it through the next year? We're not going to assume that's going to happen. But one of the most loving things you can do with your family is to plan for it in case it does happen.
That is so true.
If your kids are old enough to maturity-wise understand these conversations, this is the one level where you can bring your kids in as they get old enough to understand, letting them understand this is what mom and dad are doing. This is how we do insurance. This is why we have it. This is why we're doing our investing. This is why we have it. This is why we're paying off debt, or this is why we got out of debt, or whatever your particular walkthrough on the baby steps is. And again, if you want to know more about that, get into Financial Peace University. If you're already in Financial Peace University, go through the lessons. We're going to walk through these things in depth in there, but really understand what is our whole picture. And by the way, you can do a little bit of fun incentive after each of these. Now, maybe the 5 or 10 minute daily download is a high five.
Yeah.
Maybe the weekly weigh-in, have a little ice cream.
Okay.
Maybe the monthly meeting, you go out for dinner within reason based on where you are.
That's
And
right.
you know what? Even in step 2, I'm giving you permission.
Oh, yeah.
If you've had your monthly meeting, don't go crazy. We're not going to the $400 steakhouse
That's what Chipotle
downtown.
is for.
But go out to dinner, enjoy this time together. And after the annual one, you know what, especially if you're in a spot where you can do it, take a weekend getaway.
That's
Go get a
wonderful.
hotel or a Vrbo or Airbnb for the weekend and celebrate that you are on a great path financially, working together as a team.
That's so, to this day, I think that one of the most wonderful ways that you can prove that you are on the same page with your spouse is by talking about and financially preparing for what might happen if you're no longer there, or if they're no longer there. Because making sure your finances are in place, making sure each spouse understands the plan. We know where all the documents are. We know, what's going on with the money. When some of the saddest calls that we get are when someone's called in and they've lost a spouse, and it's like, I don't even know, I didn't even know the home wasn't in my name. I didn't even know, like, all of these things they're finding out. And so one of the ways that you can love your spouse so well is to make sure that you guys are having those conversations. But
and by the way, I'll just address the other side of that coin. Sometimes things are really good and somebody still doesn't know they're good. You may be thinking, we're set. If something happens to me, they're taken care of. I sat down, one of the toughest early moments I had in a coaching relationship with this particular lady. She was 62 years old and had just lost her husband of over 30 years. So she came in and sat down with me trying to figure out, am I going to be okay? She had no idea at 62 years old what was going on in their situation and if she was going to be okay. And as we walked through, I found that she had about $13,000 in debt that still needed taken care of. But she also had $1.2 million in assets that she didn't know about. She was a millionaire and had no idea. And it gave her a different appreciation for her husband, but also a moment where she kind of wanted to smack him, but she couldn't because he was already gone.
She's like, we could have been living.
She didn't know. So here she is on dealing with the grief of losing her husband and the uncertainty of personal finance unnecessarily. If she had just known, she could have just put all of the energy into celebrating what she and her husband had done together and the lives that they had created and the wonderful kids and grandkids and all the things that they had together, instead of having to wonder, am I going to be okay? So I do want to jump into some questions. I know we've got a couple final tips at the end of the call, but let's jump into a couple questions here. Dawn, thank you so much for being willing to jump in with us here. I would love to hear more about your question.
Hey, Dawn.
Hi. So my question is, my husband and I are on baby step 2, and we've always had 4 accounts. So his, mine, ours, where we pay our joint bills from. And then we have a business account because we have a side business. So as you guys have been talking about this morning, coming into the space of sharing the financials brings in more trust. It creates kind of more of a team situation psychologically. I'm just, because we're not there yet, I'm curious, like, what are some of the other benefits or gains that you recognize personally when you went there from being independent, right?
Right. Well, Dawn, I have a couple of questions. There was a lot in what you asked. I'll start with kind of the factual side of it. There are studies that show, just from a wealth building and money management perspective, that couples who are married and combine their finances over the course of their time together build more wealth than couples who don't share their finances. And you can honestly boil that down to like compound interest. Obviously, the bigger the nest egg is that compound interest is working on, the more money that you're going to have. So you can really boil it down to the facts and things like that. So we know that the statistics are telling us that this works. But my bigger question for you is, when you said, well, we're not there yet. That's kind of more what I'm interested in digging into is why do you feel that? Where do you think the hesitation is coming from? Is it on both of your parts? Is it just you? You know, maybe it's something in the past. I kind of want to hear more about that.
Right. So my husband and I have talked about this, and we've kind of identified like our, I'll say, psychological reasons for probably keeping separate accounts. Some things I hadn't really considered until we had the conversation. My family history, this kind of goes back a few generations. My mom and my grandmother always ended up having to hide money from their partners. And they were always very, very, there was a lot of there was just a lot of debt. And so I think for me, psychological safety, regardless, I've just always made my own money, kept my own money, managed my own money, because I didn't want to fall into the pattern that the women in my family had traditionally been in, where they have been powerless and they had been taken advantage of. My husband had similar stories. Looking at his parents, they weren't great role models for money. And some of the women he had dated or been engaged to before we were together, in his mind, they took advantage of him financially and ran up debt and just were irresponsible. So I think there is some fear
I get that.
sharing.
I get that. You know, me coming into my relationship with my husband, you know, I grew up in a house where money was lorded over more, and it was very controlled. And, you know, there were circumstances where sometimes I felt like, man, like my mom just needs more control and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And was right. You know, it was not a healthy balance at times. And so coming into my relationship with Sam, the thing that I had to understand early on, and I forced this into my brain, is this is not that relationship. And if I treat it like that relationship, something happens. And Tim, you can speak to this. If we spend a lot of our time running from something, sometimes we end up creating that thing that we were running from. We just end up creating it in a different way, as opposed to us being very intentional about running to something. So for me, I didn't want to spend my time running from a bad financial situation, running from what my parents did. Instead, I created a very clear picture in my head that I wanted to run towards. And that picture was this: I want to have ultimate trust with my husband. That is what I want. Ultimately, beyond the money, that's what was missing in the scenario that I saw growing up. And I want to create ultimate trust. If I can create that, then I'm winning. So what does that mean for me? It means that I have to trust ultimately. And that means with my money. And I had to trust myself that I have selected someone in marriage that I can trust ultimately. And I'm not saying that that's easy and that that's an easy place to get to mentally, but I am saying that it is a choice that I made, and at times had to fake it until I truly felt it and believed it. And Sam has always embodied all of those things. It was me that had to like, okay, I'll work this out. I got to work this out. Like, he's not controlling me. That's my own thing. Like, so I would encourage you to decide what it is that you want, because my guess is you do want ultimate trust. Who doesn't? You do want ultimate trust. You want that openness. You don't want to have to commit financial infidelity and hide money and hide purchases. That's not creating the life it sounds like that you want. And I think that the steps to that is creating that plan, really, you know, dreaming in high definition of what you want out of your marriage relationship as it relates to money, and doing everything you can to run towards those things, even if it's scary.
Yeah. Hey, Dawn, what's your husband's first name?
Wade.
Wade. And how long have you and Wade been married?
20 years.
Awesome. So after 20 years, what do you think of the chances you make it another 20?
Very easy. And
Good.
to answer the question, I do trust him, and I know he trusts me. We're aware this is all based past stuff that has nothing to do with who we are and how we feel about each other.
That's
so
good.
So let's address a couple of things here, because this is really important. And I forget the name of the explorer who had done this. I've read the story a bunch of times, and his name's escaping me on this particular day. But there was a particular explorer, and he and his shipmates get to this island and decide, this is where we think we want to go explore. But he also didn't want everyone getting cold feet and just leaving. And so he said, does anybody want to go back? And everyone's like, nope. He said, great. And then he went and set the boats on fire. Because when the boats were burned to the ground, the choice to go back and go backwards was off the table. And so a lot of times what happens in psychology and relationships is when we have a relationship that we see sour, either our own or those of the people that were the role models for us, we tend to want to create these escape valves. But the interesting thing, and this is what Jade was talking about, we can create that self-fulfilling prophecy where I create this as a possibility, and now it's more likely to become a possibility. Versus when we step into marriage, the ideal situation, and we'll talk about some ways to kind of build onto this, the ideal situation is let's burn the boats. Right. If in the really old marriage vows, by the way, there's actually a line that is kind of optional in some marriage vows, but in the old marriage vows, there's a line in there, forsaking all others. Meaning I am going to hitch my wagon to this person and this person only until one of us is no longer on this planet. And when we create these different opportunities to give ourselves these different ways out, then it's always in the back of our mind, oh, I've always got a way out. And sometimes we look for a reason to use it. So instead, one of the things we want to look for is, what are the things that I love about this person? So one of the things that you might even try, just as a fun thing, and by the way, everyone on this call and everyone listening to the recording of this call, try this. Start listing off the things you love about your spouse. And I'm not going to give you a minimum or a maximum. Keep writing things down until you can't think of anything else. Set the list aside, come back and add to it later as you think of more things. But one of the things that we start to find is we start to create what's called a love map. We start to think about all the things we love about this person, all the reasons we can trust this person, and we can begin to put some things together. Now, one of the practical things that you can do is you talked about these yours, mine, and ours accounts. And so and this is again for Dawn, for you and Wade, this is for everyone else who's getting the benefit of listening to Dawn sharing the story. There's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, as we are going to start to build trust together, let's do this. All of the money that's needed for our shared expenses goes into the ours account. So if we both live in the house, everything relating to the house goes into the ours account. If we're both making use of things like electricity, all of the utilities and these different utilities go into the ours account. Anything that we're both making use of goes into the ours account. Now, let me ask you this. In 20 years, Dawn, how many times has he spent money where you're like, oh no, that was cheating on money?
0.
It's almost like you guys, listening to you talk, I almost feel like if you both sat down and created a budget and made sure that on that budget, you just accounted for the things that you like to do, Dawn, and then you accounted for the things that Wade likes to do. I think that it just sounds like you both have a hesitation, but something tells me if you just jump in, it's going to work. And I feel like if you start that budget together and you make sure that, you're covering all the things, hey, this is what I do. Like I go to lunch with my girls and I get my hair done. And I like to go, I don't know, to Home Goods, and he's putting the things on, hey, I like to go get my beer, or I like to, as long as you guys are accounting for each other's needs and are able to do that. And I think that's, I think you just need to sit down and try it and find out what happens next. Do you know what I'm saying? Because I feel like just based off, you have goodwill. You've not said anything about Wade that makes me think, oh, there's a little something there. I think you both have goodwill to each other. So I think it's almost, let's try it. Let's see if it works. And I think that's going to give you a lot of discovery as to, okay, why didn't this work? And I think that's going to enlighten the next step. Does that sound?
A couple of the things I think are really, really helpful here. One, keeping a little bit of money each that you're each allowed to spend without guilt as your own separate pocket money, your fun money. There's nothing wrong with that. My wife and I have separate funds. And the rule is, as long as it's moral, legal, and ethical, we don't ask questions. I mentioned being a collector of things earlier. So like, she may roll her eyes. She's like, do you need another Yoda in the collection? Of course I need another Yoda in the collection. Got a Yoda on my mug here today. I always need more Yodas in my collection, but it's not a financial issue at that point. And also you can use this, if you have some gifting funds where you don't know what each other's spending on each other, things like Christmas and birthdays and anniversaries, that's okay. You're allowed to have some surprises with each other, even after 20 years of marriage. But here's the most important thing that I heard in your entire scenario. Both you and Wade came from cycles that you do not want to repeat. Your primary goal is to not become the people that came before you in your families. There's nothing that says that if you put your money together that you're going to become those people. In fact, what could happen instead, and this is where we're trying to avoid here, you don't want to become the mother, the grandmother, the aunt, the great grandmother, whoever that socked money away. And so to not become that person, you're socking money away. Let's break the cycle a different way. Be the first woman in that branch of the family tree to say, you know what, I'm going to trust the man that I married wholeheartedly because I believe it. I trust him. He's deserved it. And I trust myself well enough to have picked somebody who's not going to mistreat me that way.
Yep.
And you can break that cycle by actually breaking the cycle.
And you've said with your own words that everything Tim said is true. You've said, hey, he's not broken my trust. You've declared here that he's a trustworthy guy, that you've had no reason to, suspect anything else. And I agree 100% with what Tim is saying. I think that you're closer to all the things that we spoke about. I think you're closer than you think. I think you just got to step off the ledge there and try it. And I think that that'll lead to the next thing. And I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised. It sounds like you guys are a good match. It sounds like you do life together well in every other area. And I think this was just that one area of surrender that was left. And I think if you surrender it, I think you're going to be just fine.
Dawn, how does that sound to you?
Actually, there's been several things you both mentioned that sound really doable, and I'm very excited to try them. Yay. So thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. I love this conversation, y'all. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't call out that there are times that there are situations where we do not want these money combined.
Yes,
if you are in an abusive relationship that's abusive, do not submit to abuse. Do not be putting your money together with somebody who's abusive. That is a bad idea. Addictions, right? If you've got a chemical addiction, gambling addiction, pornography addiction, any number of addictions that do exist within our addiction world, this may be the time when the person who is not facing the addiction takes control over all of the finances, because the person fighting an addiction needs all that space in their mind to fight their addiction.
That's loving them well.
It's loving them well, and it's loving your whole family well to make sure that somebody in their addiction does not blow up the future for the family.
Very good.
And this is an appropriate time when that is happening. And by the way, does that mean that they can never be trusted with the family finances again? No. But if you have somebody who's spending every weekend heading down to the casino, or they're constantly coming home intoxicated, or they're constantly, you get the bills from the internet or the debit cards or whatever, and you're realizing, holy cow, they're spending what on pornography? This is insane. Like, when those things are happening, we've got to build the trust back. This may mean that for a period of time, A, we're getting good counseling involved to help to help with the actual addiction, and B, that as this is going on, that whoever is not the one facing the addiction, take that time, take that control for a time until we can rebuild the trust. And by the way, if you are the spouse of somebody who is addicted, if you are a spouse who's been abused, if you are a spouse who's been mistreated, you deserve help as well.
Yes.
And by the way, in a situation, I'm not trying to equate addiction with abuse, by the way. Abuse is a very, very different thing. Abuse, get out. And in a situation where there's an addiction, you can choose to stay, and there's nothing wrong with choosing to stay, but also get the help that you need. Get the help you need for your spouse, get the help that you need for yourself. There's lots of really great resources to help those who are family and friends of people who are fighting an addiction. Make use of those resources. So Jade, let's walk through a couple final thoughts here, a couple final tips and tricks for everybody to make sure that we are on board with our spouses and working well in our futures.
What if I saw that there's a couple more people who joined. What if we just do a quick recap and then hit that final point?
Go for it.
So we talked about communication being key. Have those hard communications early and often, whether it's in a dating relationship, an engagement relationship, and even in a marriage relationship. Talk about and be open with your finances early and often. Try to avoid harsh words like you, yours, and use French words like we and ours. Right?
There's a difference between you need and I need.
Yes.
You need, bad plan. Right now we're pointing the finger. You need to do this. I need you to participate with me.
That's great.
I need to feel safe. I don't feel safe when these things are happening. Can you help me meet my needs by helping interact with me in this way?
Love that.
I need, you need, down.
And it would be nice for us to work on. I love that phrase. I'd love for us to work on.
I would feel
XYZ.
extra loved by
Whew,
this.
love
Let's
it.
put these things in positive terms,
I
moving in the
love it.
right direction.
So good. And Tim hit briefly on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Good gracious. These are the things not to do in the conversation, right? We don't want to have criticism, no contempt, no defensiveness. Try to cut back on the stonewalling and be open and honest in conversation. And finally, we talked about combining your money. Once you are married and you are in a healthy relationship, free of the things that we talked about, abuse, gambling, you do want to combine your money. That's one of the ultimate ways that you can show trust in your partner. And as always, share the load, be a good team player. As much as you can automate the things going on in your financial life, automate them. He's always going to be the one that takes care of going online and paying the mortgage out of our money. I'm always the one that does that first draft of the budget and I bring it to Sam for us to go over it together. Automate those things. And of course, Tim shared about the DWMA. This is our daily habit, our weekly habit, monthly and annual habits that we're setting to talk about, our marriage and the state of our money. All right. And the final thing that we want to talk about is in all of this, guys, none of this is going to work if you're not self-aware. Again, we're pointing back to self and going, what am I contributing to this? And what can I contribute to make this a better situation? We talked briefly earlier about the two main money personalities, the free spirit and the nerd. You got to know who you are. You got to know, are you a free spirit? Are you a nerd? Are you a person who operates out of scarcity mentality? Or are you a person who has an abundance mentality? Knowing that going in is so important because it informs how you relate to different situations in marriage and money. And I put this on here, you kind of got to know going in. If I'm entering into a relationship, if I'm a princess and I love being spoiled and I'm used to just being able to spend and do whatever I want, I have got to own that. Or if you're, what I call, little boys and you're coming in and you're used to being able to buy your toys and, I make my money and I can spend my money the way I want. We have got to understand that these are the parts of us that need to change. And it takes the pressure off when you can look at yourself and go, hey, I'm a little spoiled. Like I have spoiled tendencies. It takes the pressure off the other spouse to say, hey, you're a little spoiled, because that's going to be a little bit of an argument. So as much as you can look at yourself and go, okay, this is what I do, but it makes it tough. This is not contributing something good to the relationship. As much as you can look at that for yourself and call it out and say, hey, you know what? I have noticed, I can be a little spoiled sometimes. So let's work on that. That is, man, it just does worlds of good.
Honey, can you help me with is a far better statement than honey, I think you need to.
Yes.
Right. Can you help me with? And as we think about what am I contributing to the success or the lack thereof in my marriage?
Yes.
What am I contributing to the conflict or the lack thereof in our marriage? What are the things that I'm bringing to the table? What are the reasons that I'm lovable?
Yes.
And how do I get to be more of that? Because one of the things that's so interesting is when we start to think about how we can serve each other well, our marriages change. Because like we said at the beginning of the call, the purpose of marriage is, can you do life together better than you could do on your own? For those of you that are people of faith, can you serve the kingdom of God better as a team than as an individual? And if that's the case, then go for it, because marriage is wonderful. It is beautiful. It is created by God and is one of the single greatest examples of how God interacts with humanity.
And it should stretch. It should stretch you.
If it's not stretching you, you're not doing something right.
That's true. That's good, man.
So again, great conversation today. Thank you all for being here. Just wanted to remind you again, if you are already in Financial Peace University, make sure you're working through these lessons together if you're married. Or you know what, if you're not married yet and you're working on becoming married, go through this with your fiance or your significant other. There's nothing wrong with learning these principles together and making sure it's a good fit.
Just don't combine your money yet.
Just don't combine until you're legally married, because there's legal protections. If you want to see it, pick an episode of Judge Judy, anyone, you can find them on YouTube. You'll see why not to combine money with someone you're not married to. Trust me on this one. The other thing is, if you're already working through Financial Peace University and you have not yet gotten some coaching yet, and you get to see, for example, Dawn, she got to walk through with us today. If you want to do this, we have group coaching available for all Financial Peace University members. And if you want individual coaching, you can actually connect with a Ramsey preferred coach who will sit down with you and your spouse if you're married, and walk through these things to figure out, how do we put these things together? How do we take those bricks out of our backpack? How do we overcome these past challenges? How do we become who we're meant to be with the marriage that we're meant to have? So as always, you can find those things at ramseysolutions.com. It has been an absolute blast to hang out with you all today. We will talk to you all again soon, but
Yes.
until then, take care and
See
God
you
bless
next time.
everybody.
Bye.